I'm Clara Mitchell, the daughter who was always told she wasn't enough. All my life, my younger brother Daniel was the pride of our family, while I was the shadow in the corner, the one no one believed in. But on the morning of his award ceremony, when I asked him a simple question, his answer cut deeper than I ever expected. That moment pushed me to open a briefcase I had kept hidden for years, filled with truths no one wanted to face. What happens when the child who was always dismissed finally decides to speak? And what if the family golden boy isn't as untouchable as everyone believes? I sat in my small apartment in Chicago on a winter morning, the pale light slipping through a dust-coated window. The silence was heavy, broken only by the groan of my old coffee maker as it sputtered to life. The room smelled faintly of burnt beans and stale air, and across from me, hanging neatly on the door, was the one gray blazer I owned. The only thing decent enough to wear to a place where people carried themselves with confidence and power. The blazer had been with me for years, pressed and folded carefully as if waiting for a day when I would need to look like I belonged. But that day had rarely come. Most mornings I stared at it. Knowing it was too formal for the quiet job interviews I barely landed, too hopeful for the narrow life I'd been pushed into. Yet somehow I kept it. Perhaps because deep down I believed I would need it one day, not for fitting in but for standing tall. The phone on the table vibrated, its sound startling in the quiet. I reached for it, brushing dust from the glass. My heart knew before my eyes confirmed. It was today Daniel's big day. My younger brother, the golden child of our family, was set to receive the Executive Leadership Award, a title that rolled off the tongue like polished marble. My parents had mentioned it with pride, the cousins with awe, the family friends with admiration. Everyone knew. Everyone except me. Or perhaps I wasn't supposed to know. I pressed the call button, listening to the ring stretch out like a thin thread between us. When his voice finally filled the line, it carried the sharpness I had come to expect. "Hi, Daniel. When's the ceremony happening?" I asked, trying to sound casual, as if I hadn't been waiting for weeks to hear it. As if I hadn't marked my calendar in secret, waiting for him to extend a hand that never came. His answer was a blade wrapped in silk. "Yesterday. You missed it." My hand stiffened around the phone. A pause stretched long enough for me to hear the smirk behind his words. The kind of smirk that didn't need to be seen to be felt, heavy and mocking. My lips parted, but no sound came. He let out a faint chuckle, quiet enough to pretend it wasn't there, loud enough to make sure I heard. Something inside me cracked. I knew Daniel well enough to understand this wasn't a mistake. He had wanted me excluded. He had wanted me sitting here on this gray winter morning, picturing him basking in the applause, the family gathering around him like bees to honey, while I was left in the dark. He had orchestrated it carefully, as if my absence was part of his grand performance. The phone felt heavier in my hand. For a moment I thought of our childhood, the way our parents would beam when Daniel brought home good grades, the way their voices would soften for him, their shoulders straightening with pride. And me. I was the daughter who studied too much, who earned degrees that didn't translate into money or prestige. The daughter our father once dismissed with a single line, all that education, and for what I could almost hear those words again, sharp and dismissive, reverberating in my head. I had carried them like scars, invisible but deep. I ended the call without saying goodbye. The silence that followed was louder than his laugh, and my fingers trembled as I set the phone down on the wooden table. Not from fear, not from sadness. From anger tightly coiled and refusing to stay hidden anymore. My eyes landed on the corner of the room. There it was. The leather briefcase I hadn't touched in months, its edges worn, its handle cracked from years of use. Inside lay the documents I had collected piece by piece over the last 2 years. Numbers, contracts. Letters, evidence carefully stitched together by long nights and quiet persistence. Proof that what the world believed about Daniel, what our family believed about me, was only half the story. I had told myself 100 times to let it go, that family was family, that silence was safer than confrontation. But silence had never protected me. Silence had only fed his arrogance, nourished his belief that I would never rise, never question, never expose. I placed my hand on the briefcase, feeling the cool leather under my palm. For the first time in years, it didn't feel like a burden. It felt like a key. I stood slowly, the room tilting as blood rushed to my face. My reflection in the dusty window startled me. My hair tied back loosely, my eyes darkened with something new. Resolve. The kind I didn't know I carried. I reached for the gray blazer, sliding it over my shoulders. It fit snug more than I remembered, as if it had been waiting for this very morning. I straightened the lapels, smoothed the fabric, and stared at myself. Not at the tired woman life had worn down, but at someone who was no longer willing to be left behind. Breathing deeply, I whispered into the silence of the room, almost as if answering a question no one had asked. Enough. If Daniel thought I would sit quietly in the shadows while he bathed in light, he was wrong. If he thought my story was over, he hadn't read the right chapters. Today, the roles would begin to shift. I tightened my grip on the briefcase, the weight grounding me. My steps echoed softly on the wooden floor as I moved toward the door. The cold air seeped in through the cracks, biting against my skin, but it only made me more awake. I wasn't walking into his world to watch him shine. I was walking into my own beginning. The elevator carried me slowly upward, its hum steady, its light a dim glow against the mirrored walls. Each number lit up above the doors seemed to sting me with a memory, a reminder of the times my family measured me against Daniel and found me lacking. With every floor I rose, another scar came back to life. I thought of the night I first held the letter from Stanford in my trembling hands. The scholarship offer for a PhD program felt like a door opening to a future I had fought for with sleepless nights and relentless discipline. My heart had pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears as I ran to show my mother. She looked at the letter, her lips curving into a polite smile that never touched her eyes. "That is wonderful, Clara," she had said softly. "But your brother is already building a real career. Books are your strength, not the world out there." My father sat across the table, leaning back in his chair, nodding as if her words were scripture. "People need doers, not professors," he added, his voice laced with certainty. The letter trembled in my hand, as if absorbing my disappointment. That moment carved itself into me, leaving a wound that never quite healed. The elevator groaned and shook slightly, pulling me back into the present. The glow of the numbers above the doors reminded me I was still rising floor by floor toward the place where those old wounds would finally meet their reckoning. As the elevator climbed higher, another memory pressed in. While I drowned in research papers and late-night readings, Daniel would stride through the front door in his tailored suits, his new girlfriend on his arm, the kind who looked like she belonged in a glossy magazine. He spoke about clients and investments, words none of us fully understood. But it didn't matter. My parents' faces lit up in admiration, their eyes wide with pride, their voices brimming with approval. And me, I stayed silent. Silence was my only shield. The elevator ticked upward. The numbers blinked steady and unrelenting. I had tried to fight for recognition once. When I started a small consulting firm, I showed my father the business plan I had spent months perfecting. He flipped through the pages with a detached glance, then chuckled. "This looks like office games, Clara. Daniel is the one out there fighting real battles." His words stung more than I admitted at the time. But worse than his dismissal was what came after. They mortgaged the house to fund one of Daniel's startups, a project I knew in my bones would collapse. I warned them, pleaded with them, but my words meant nothing. For them, Daniel was always the rising star. I was just the shadow following behind, too dim to matter. I pressed my hand against the leather briefcase at my side, my knuckles whitening. The elevator dinged its bell, cutting through my memories. The doors slid open, revealing the top floor of Morgan Tech. The hallway stretched out before me, sleek and polished, the air humming with the quiet confidence of power. I stepped forward, the briefcase heavy in my grasp, each step echoing against the glossy wood floors. For years they had believed I was just the quiet daughter with a modest apartment and an old car, a woman who clung to books and theories while life passed her by. They had no idea what I had built in the silence they mistook for weakness. Every dollar saved, every contract signed behind closed doors, every late night spent negotiating instead of sleeping, all of it had brought me here. They thought I was a shadow, But shadows can grow, can take shape, can darken into storms. The briefcase thudded gently against my leg as I walked, its weight no longer a burden, but a promise. My reflection followed me along the glossy panels of the wall, a reminder that I was no longer the timid girl they once dismissed. Each scar my family left on me had once been a wound. Today they were wearing armor. Today they were the weapons I carried into this place. The elevator doors slid open, and I stepped into the world Daniel had always claimed as his territory. The hallway stretched wide and gleaming, its floor padded with thick carpet that silenced most footsteps. Its walls lined with panels of glass reflecting golden light from chandeliers above. The scent of expensive cologne lingered faintly in the air, sharp yet elegant, a perfume that belonged to those who thought power was theirs by right. At once I knew I looked different. My gray blazer, pressed and plain, was no match for the tailored suits and silk dresses that swept past me. Men adjusted their cufflinks with practiced ease, women walked with heels that clicked like punctuation marks against stone, and I felt their gazes slide across me like cold knives. Some allowed themselves a quick glance at my jacket, then quickly turned away as though my presence were an error in the polished order of the place. A small smile touched my lips, almost involuntary. They didn't know. They saw an outsider, but I was no stranger to these walls. What they could not see was that in silence, in years of patient calculation, I had stitched myself into the very foundation of this company. While Daniel paraded through boardrooms with borrowed charm and polished arrogance, I had acquired my stake piece by piece, unseen yet steady. These people thought they were walking in Daniel's world. They would soon realize they were standing in mine. My phone buzzed in my hand. Daniel's name lit up the screen, and for a moment a pulse of irritation traveled through me. I opened the message, and his words appeared as sharp as ever. "Stay in the back. Don't embarrass me." I froze where I stood. The words were short-clipped, but they carried the weight of a lifetime. My chest tightened, not with pain but with recognition. From childhood, Daniel had never missed a chance to remind me of my place. I remembered the birthday dinners when relatives gathered, their laughter loud around the table. Daniel would whisper from across the plates, "Don't talk too much." I remembered holiday evenings when I tried to share news of my studies, only for him to lean close, smirking as he muttered, "Don't make me look bad." At first it was teasing, or so everyone said, but over the years the message calcified into something more deliberate. He needed me quiet, diminished, invisible, so his shine would never be challenged. Even now, standing in this tower with its gold light and glass walls, his voice reached me in the same way it always had, an attempt to pull me back, to keep me in the shadows. I stared at the message until the letters blurred. Then I slid the phone into my pocket and drew a slow breath. This time I would not obey. My heels clicked against the polished stone floor as I resumed walking. The sound echoed softly in the wide corridor, and with each step I felt the weight of years lift just slightly. Each sound was a heartbeat, each echo a vow. I would not walk behind him anymore. Two men in dark suits passed by, speaking in low tones about quarterly reports and client dinners. One of them glanced at me, then away, his eyes carrying the quiet dismissal of someone who had already decided I was unimportant. I let him look. Let them all look. Their ignorance was to my advantage. To them I was still the woman in the gray blazer, the one who looked out of place. That suited me. When the truth came, it would land heavier for being unexpected. My hand brushed the edge of my leather briefcase as I walked, grounding me. The hall stretched on long and shining, a corridor of wealth and power that had always seemed closed to me. Yet with each step forward, I felt less like an intruder and more like the rightful owner reclaiming her space. The voices grew louder ahead, muffled but urgent, spilling through the glass doors at the end of the hall. I could almost hear the announcer's tone, rehearsed and proud, ready to speak Daniel's name. He would be standing at the front, straight-backed and certain, waiting for the applause he believed he deserved. But applause could not drown out the truth. I reached the end of the hallway, the doors towering before me. They were double-paned, spotless, their handles gleaming silver under the light. My reflection looked back at me, small but steady eyes, dark with something I had not seen in myself for years. I lifted my hand and pressed my palm against the cold handle. The metal bit against my skin, grounding me once again. I inhaled deep and deliberate, and in that pause I felt everything converge, every dismissal, every smirk, every scar Daniel had carved into me. They were no longer wounded. They were steel. I was not here to play his shadow anymore. I was here to shatter the illusion he had built so carefully. With a single push, I opened the doors and stepped into the light. The glass doors closed behind me, and the hum of the hall washed over me at once, thick and overwhelming like waves crashing against stone. Crystal chandeliers spilled their light across rows of polished suits and shimmering gowns, their brilliance meant to dazzle, to erase flaws and magnify triumphs. My heels tapped against the wooden floor, a steady rhythm that felt almost defiant. Faces turned briefly, then dismissed me, deciding in an instant that I didn't belong here. At the front row sat Daniel, framed like a photograph of success. His navy suit was razor sharp, his tie perfectly knotted, his hair slicked back until it gleamed. He leaned close to our father, who whispered something that drew an easy laugh from them both. On his other side, my mother's hands rested neatly on her lap, her posture regal, her eyes glistening with devotion. To them, Daniel was still the chosen one, their miracle, their vindication. I moved slowly down the aisle, every step drawing me nearer to their orbit. Daniel's eyes flicked toward me, and his polished smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Irritation tightened his jaw, and he shifted just enough to lean toward me, his words slicing through the air, pitched low so only I could hear. "Why are you even here? Just sit down and don't cause a scene?" The words struck with the same old edge honed from years of practice. Not a plea, but an order. Not concern, but contempt. Once they might have silenced me. I remembered birthday dinners where his whisper, "Don't talk too much," kept me quiet while our relatives laughed. Holidays when my attempts to share an achievement were smothered by his smirk and his hissed warning, "Don't make me look bad." All those little cuts had trained me to shrink, but tonight his words slid off me like water on stone. They didn't pierce, they revealed. They showed me he still thought I was the same shadow he could dismiss with a sentence. I met his stare evenly for a beat, letting him see the calm he couldn't shake. Then I turned away without a word and slipped into a seat halfway down the aisle. My briefcase rested against my leg, solid. Waiting. My hand found the handle, gripping it firmly, grounding me in the truth it carried. The murmur of the room quieted. The chandeliers dimmed slightly, and a hush rippled across the hall. A spotlight ignited at the stage, striking the wooden podium in a burst of brilliance. Applause erupted, a wave of thunder rolling through the crowd as the side doors opened and Miranda Chen, CEO of Morgan Tech, strode forward. She moved with calm authority, her black gown understated, but commanding every gesture, radiating control. She reached the podium, adjusted the microphone, and lifted her eyes to the audience. The applause faded into silence, the kind of silence that leaned forward, expectant, ready. Daniel straightened in his chair, his body taut with anticipation. My father's chest expanded, as if he himself were about to accept the award. My mother leaned toward the stage, lips parted, her whole being focused on the name she was certain was coming. I glanced at Daniel once more. He sat, proud hands folded loosely, as though already cradling the honor. His certainty filled the room like perfume, cloying and arrogant. But I knew something they did not. My hand tightened on the briefcase, its weight a steady reminder that tonight was not his story to claim. Miranda's voice carried clear and measured into the silence. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight is not only a night of recognition, it is a turning point in the history of Morgan Tech." The air tightened, charged with expectation. The crowd leaned forward, the silence humming with anticipation of a single name. I sat steady, my heartbeat, even my gaze fixed on the stage. Within moments, the world Daniel believed he ruled would be stripped bare. And for the first time in years, I felt no fear of what was coming. The lights poured down onto the stage, catching the polished silver of the microphone and scattering reflections across the room. Miranda Chen stood at the podium with a composure that stilled the air itself. Her gaze swept over the hall, not hurried, not forced, but deliberate, as if she could read the restless thoughts tucked away in every head before her. The murmurs quieted one by one until the only sound was the faint hum of the lighting above. In the first row, Daniel sat unmoving, his lips curled upward, fixed in a self-satisfied smile. His hands rested loosely on his lap, though I knew his mind was pacing, rehearsing his speech, line by line, ready for the moment he had imagined 1,000 times. His confidence was thick enough to be seen like a second suit draped over his shoulders. Miranda lifted a folder from the podium. She held it steady for a moment, then opened it slowly, her silence purposeful. I could feel the weight of that pause ripple through the room. When she finally spoke, her words struck with precision, every syllable clear. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight, we are not only celebrating achievement, we are welcoming a new chapter for Morgan Tech. Daniel leaned forward, his body angling toward the stage, his chest rising with expectation. My father straightened in his seat, his fingers tightening around my mother's hand. She looked radiant eyes, shimmering with pride, her face glowing as though she were already basking in her son's triumph. Their entire being was tuned to this moment, waiting for the name they had always believed belonged to him. I sat still. My heartbeat was steady, not rushed, not hesitant. For years I had lived for this breath, and now that it had come, I was calm. Please join me. Miranda continued, her voice rising slightly and welcoming the new majority owner of Morgan Tech, Dr. Clara Mitchell. The hall froze. A silence deeper than disbelief spread across the seats. The whispers stopped, the shuffling of programs ceased, even the sound of breathing seemed to stall. Then came the sharp rustle of paper, Daniel's script sliding from his hands, scattering across the floor like brittle leaves. He had carried that speech with him for weeks, guarding it, polishing it, preparing for his spotlight. Now it lay useless at his feet. I saw his face drain of color. His grin collapsed, stiffening into a grimace. His eyes darted wide and frantic, searching for an escape, for some explanation that could restore the story he had told himself. But there was none. My mother blinked rapidly as if her vision had betrayed her. She shook her head once, then, again her lips parting but no words forming. My father's mouth moved faintly, the barest whisper slipping out. No, this cannot be. The spell of their pride cracked in that instant. I rose from my seat. The sound of my heels striking the wooden floor broke the hush, each step ringing out into the stunned silence. The audience turned toward me as if following the echo itself. My briefcase swung gently at my side, its weight familiar, its contents undeniable. Step by step, the light from the stage reached for me, pulling me out of the shadows I had lived in for so long. For the first time, it was not Daniel walking into the glow, it was me. Daniel's gaze locked on mine. His face was pale, his lips tight, his hands gripping the arms of his chair so hard his knuckles whitened. There was no smirk now, no quiet whisper of condescension, only fear. I walked up the steps and stood beside Miranda. She turned slightly, her eyes meeting mine, offering the smallest nod of acknowledgement, of respect. The applause had not yet started. The audience was still caught in the aftershock, suspended in disbelief. I reached for the microphone, the metal cool beneath my fingers. For a breath, I let the silence hold the weight of the moment pressing down on the hall. Then I lifted my head and spoke, my voice calm but carrying to every corner of the room. Thank you, Miranda. And thank you to all of you for being here tonight to witness the truth. The room remained hushed, a collective breath held tight. Every eye turned from Daniel to me, and I knew in that instant the illusion he had built was gone. His night had ended before it began, and the world he thought he ruled was now looking at me. I stood at the microphone, the stage lights pouring down on me so brightly I could barely see the rows of faces stretched out beneath them. The heat of the lamps pressed against my skin, but my hands did not tremble. Instead, every vein in my body seemed to surge with a strength I had never known, as though all the years of silence, all the years of swallowing humiliation had been stored for this moment. Hundreds of eyes were fixed on me, some wide with shock, some narrowed with doubt, all waiting to see whether I belonged here. I drew a long breath, letting the air fill me, and when I spoke, my voice carried steady and deliberate. Before we speak about the future of Morgan Tech, I must remind you of a few things from its past. The hall grew utterly still. Even the faint shuffling of programs and the soft coughs that usually ripple through large gatherings had vanished. Daniel shifted in his seat, and I could see from the corner of my eye that his complexion had drained to a sickly pale. He sat frozen, his lips pressing together as if he thought he could silence me with his glare alone. Everyone here knows Daniel Mitchell as a rising star. I said my words sharp enough to cut through the silence. But how many of you know that during the Harrison Project, the person who actually did the work was not Daniel at all, but Jennifer Torres? The reaction was immediate. A wave of murmurs swept through the hall. Heads turned, necks craned, and I saw Jennifer herself sitting a few rows back. Her eyes were wide, her hand covering her mouth, the other trembling slightly in her lap. Jennifer worked tirelessly, I continued, even while pregnant. She gave her nights her strength, her very health to that project. But when she left to give birth, Daniel signed the final documents under his own name and claimed every bit of credit. The whispering in the audience swelled. People leaned toward each other, faces contorting with disbelief and recognition. Jennifer lowered her head, her shoulders shaking as her eyes filled. Daniel shot up from his chair. His voice cracked louder than he meant it to be. That's how business works. Don't pretend you don't understand, Clara. You know the game. I cut him off before he could gather momentum, my voice rising cold and unyielding. Business or theft? The words landed like a hammer. The room erupted into sharper whispers, louder, heavier. I could feel the crowd shifting, could see heads snapping back to Daniel with suspicion instead of admiration. He opened his mouth again, but the room was no longer his. He turned toward our parents, desperate, searching for their familiar support. My father stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. His face was flushed, his eyes sharp with panic as he shouted hoarsely, "Clara, stop this! You are destroying this family's reputation." The ache of his words struck me, but only for a second. I held his gaze, my own steady and unblinking. Reputation cannot be built on lies, Father. Not even ours. He faltered, his mouth opening again, but no sound followed. The authority he had wielded all my life hung useless in the air. I reached down and pulled a thick folder from my briefcase, the weight of the papers heavy in my hands. I lifted them high so all could see. And here, I declared, is the Stevens Tech acquisition. Daniel concealed a massive pension debt, hiding it from the board. If this deal had gone through, Morgan Tech would have inherited $120 million in toxic liabilities. The hall broke into chaos. People gasped. Chairs shifted noisily and voices overlapped in frantic murmurs. Some clutched at the arms of their seats, others leaned forward in disbelief. The calm veneer of the event had shattered into raw confusion. Daniel's face twisted as he stumbled for words. That's just strategy. Everyone does it. It's how the game is played. No, Daniel. I answered, my voice ringing with steel. Not everyone lies. And tonight, the truth is here for all to see. You will never sit as executive vice president of this company. The sound carried across the hall, echoing against the high ceiling, reverberating through the stunned silence that followed. For a moment, it felt as though the entire room had forgotten to breathe. Daniel stood rigid, his body trembling, his face drained of the triumph it had carried minutes ago. My father slumped back into his seat, staring at nothing while my mother covered her mouth, her shoulders hunched in disbelief, and I felt the weight of my own voice, the strange, steady power of it. For the first time, the story did not belong to Daniel. It belonged to me. The echoes of the uproar from the hall still clung to me as I closed the glass door of the CEO's office behind us. The noise outside faded into a muffled hum, leaving a silence so heavy it seemed to press down on my chest. The golden light above cast long shadows over the dark wooden table, its polished surface scattered with sealed folders waiting to be opened. My parents entered behind Daniel, their footsteps hesitant, while he was quick, angry, unsteady. The door shut with a final click, cutting us off from the crowd, from their curious stares, leaving only family and the truth that could no longer be ignored. It was my mother, Helen, who broke the silence first. Her voice trembled, though fury edged every syllable. "Clara, what have you done? You stood there in front of the whole company and humiliated your brother. How could you?" Daniel's rage burst forward before I could answer. His face was flushed crimson, his jaw clenched so tightly the veins in his neck stood out. He jabbed his finger toward me like it was a weapon. "You ruined my night. You can't take away everything I worked for." I met his eyes calm, even cold, and let my voice fall steady between us. "You didn't work for it, Daniel. You stole. You concealed. You lied. And tonight, everyone knows." My words hit him like a slap, but before he could respond, our father slammed his palm down against the table. The sound echoed through the office, rattling even the folders stacked neatly at the edge. His voice came out hard, every word bitten off. "Enough, Clara. You're turning yourself into a traitor. This is your family." I turned my head toward him slowly. My heart twisted, but my voice remained unwavering. "Family doesn't mean blindness. You and Mother mortgaged your home for Daniel, poured every hope into him, believed every word he said. And me. You dismissed me, mocked me, told me I was nothing but books and theory. But while you looked away, I became the one holding this company together." My mother gasped softly, tears pooling in her eyes. She shook her head, her shoulders trembling as she whispered through sobs. "Clara, you don't understand. Daniel is our hope." The weight of her words landed heavy, but I no longer bowed beneath them. I pulled out a chair and sat behind the CEO's desk, the seat that now belonged to me. My briefcase rested against the leg of the table. I opened it slowly, sliding another stack of files onto the polished wood, their pages crisp and unyielding. "I understand better than anyone," I said, letting the silence sharpen my words. "And because I understand, I cannot allow Daniel to stay in leadership." Daniel's eyes widened, his mouth parting in disbelief as I fixed my gaze on him. "From this day forward, Daniel Mitchell, you are reassigned to the Minneapolis office. Your new title, Regional Sales Manager." The words fell into the room with finality. For a moment, no one moved. My brother's body stiffened, his eyes bulging with shock. His lips quivered, opening and closing without forming sound. His hands trembled as though he couldn't grasp the edges of reality. My father stared at me, his face drained of color, then turned to my mother. She clutched his arm, her tears streaking down her cheeks, her gaze darting between her children as if searching for a bridge that no longer existed. The silence thickened, wrapping around us like a shroud. I leaned back slightly in the chair, the leather firm against my shoulders. My hands rested calmly on the desk. Inside, my pulse pounded with the enormity of what I had just done, but on the surface I was composed. For once I wasn't the daughter silenced, the sister dismissed. I was the one making decisions, and this I knew was only the beginning. 3 months later, Chicago basked under the brightness of spring. The lakefront shimmered, the breeze carried the scent of blossoms, and the streets hummed with new beginnings. Yet in my chest the air was cold heavy with thoughts of Minneapolis, the city where Daniel now lived. Reports arrived weekly from the regional office, and each page told the same story in different numbers. Revenues slipping, clients disappearing, trust evaporating. The charm that once seemed untouchable had finally worn thin. I heard whispers before I even saw the numbers. Daniel dragged himself into work late, his suit unkempt, his tie, loose the polish on his shoes, long gone. The confidence in his eyes had dulled into a weary glaze, the kind born of sleepless nights and desperate mornings. Employees spoke in hushed tones about debts piling up, about money lost in places that were never wise to enter. His decline was no longer private, it was common knowledge. Meanwhile, Chicago's press circled like hawks. Rachel Green, a journalist known for cutting to the bone, published a piece titled, "Sister Topples Brother, a Power Shift at Morgan Tech." It spread like fire, debated on television panels, dissected in cafes, whispered over dinner tables. Overnight, the Mitchell family was no longer admired, but pitied, even ridiculed. In the suburbs, my parents bore the heaviest blow. Father's golf partners, once eager for his handshake, now kept their distance. Invitations dried up. Mother, who had so often bragged of Daniel, avoided her neighbor's eyes, terrified that polite small talk would dig up shame. The pride they had built around him had become a cage, and now they lived inside it. Daniel himself, stripped of applause, became something worse than forgotten. He became a joke. Colleagues snickered when he left a room, clients rolled their eyes at the sound of his name. And instead of owning the wreckage, Daniel did what he always did. He looked for someone else to blame. One night the phone rang. His voice came through, thick with drink, slurred and bitter. "All of this is your fault, Clara. If it weren't for you, I'd be vice president right now. I'd have everything I closed my eyes, listening to the fury of a man who had never learned to face himself." His words rolled over me, sharp but powerless. Just echoes of every excuse he had ever made. Without replying, I lowered the receiver, letting the dial tone replace him. The report lay open on my desk. Losses climbing, credit lines exhausted, accounts bleeding red. His downfall was no longer just about pride. It was a financial quicksand pulling him deeper with every passing day. I leaned back, staring out at the horizon stretching across Chicago. 3 months had undone what years of arrogance had built. Yet I knew with clarity this was not the end. This was only the first tremor, the beginning of a collapse that would shake not only him but the parents who had stood so blindly behind him. Because the next blow would not come from me. It would come from them. That evening, I was still reviewing financial reports in my office when my secretary announced 2 unexpected visitors. I looked up, half expecting a client, or perhaps Rachel Green with more questions for her next article. But when the door opened, it was my parents who stepped inside. They no longer carried the proud posture I had grown up seeing. My father Richard had his shoulders bent, the lines on his face deeper than ever. His once starched suit sagged with wrinkles, and his thinning hair glimmered under the warm light of the room. My mother Helen followed slowly, her eyes swollen and rimmed red, her makeup smudged in places, as though she had tried and failed to cover the exhaustion etched into her skin. For a moment none of us spoke. The silence was thick, filled with years of words unspoken and wounds left raw. Finally Helen's voice broke through, raspy and trembling. "Clara, we need to talk. About the house." I gestured toward the chairs in front of my desk. They exchanged a glance before lowering themselves slowly, as if the weight of what they carried made even sitting a burden. My father cleared his throat, but his words dropped heavy, each one like stone hitting water. We're about to lose the house. We mortgaged it twice, to help Daniel. This time, we can't make the payments." I felt the words strike, though I was not surprised. I had suspected as much for months. The late-night calls I overheard, the way their voices carried tension whenever finances surfaced, the nervous way my mother's eyes flickered whenever I asked about them. Still hearing it spoken aloud by the same man who once told me to stay in my lane and stick to books knotted something in my chest. I laid the reports aside, folding my hands over them, then met their eyes. "So now, after all these years of pouring everything into Daniel, you've come to me. After dismissing me, mocking me, calling me nothing but an academic, you expect me to carry the burden of his failures?" Helen broke down in sobs, clutching a tissue in trembling fingers. "Clara, you don't understand. Daniel just needs one more chance. If we lose the house, we'll have nothing left." My father slammed his palm against the edge of the desk, the sharp sound reverberating across the office. "You have a company, Clara. You have power, resources. You can save us." I leaned back in my chair, letting their desperation hang in the air. My voice, when it came, was measured, cool. "I could, but there would be conditions." Richard frowned, his brows furrowing, as suspicion replaced his plea. Conditions. I reached into my case and pulled out 3 prepared documents, sliding them across the polished wood. My fingers lingered on the top sheet for a moment before I released it. "First, you will not give Daniel another dollar. Not a loan, not a gift, not a penny under any circumstance. Second, you will attend mandatory financial counseling sessions together. And third, you will sign a written acknowledgement that for years you favored Daniel, dismissed me, and treated me as less." The silence that followed was suffocating. My father's face turned crimson, his jaw set hard. He pushed back his chair and stood so quickly it screeched against the floor. His voice shook with outrage. "This is blackmail." I rose slowly to meet his height, my gaze unflinching. No, this is accountability. The room stilled heavy with the weight of words that could not be taken back. My mother's sobs quieted into silence, her hands limp in her lap. My father stood rigid, his chest heaving, but he could not meet my eyes. Between them passed a look of shock and helplessness, the kind that belonged not to parents, but to people who had just realized their power had slipped away. I held their gaze, knowing what this night meant. For the first time, the balance of our family had shifted. The authority they once wielded over me was gone, and in its place stood a truth neither of them could ignore. That evening in the office where they had come seeking rescue, I understood with absolute clarity the Mitchell family had changed forever. The lamp on my desk cast a muted amber glow spilling across the stack of documents I had placed carefully in front of them. The room felt suspended in time, the kind of silence where even the tick of the wall clock seemed too loud. My parents sat across from me, their bodies stiff, their eyes pinned to the printed words, as though they were not mere contracts but verdicts, sentences carved into paper that could not be undone. My mother's shoulders trembled with every shallow breath. Her fingers twisted a tissue until it nearly tore her knuckles pale under the strain. My father remained standing rigid as a soldier bracing against a storm, yet his expression betrayed the truth. The storm had already passed through him, leaving cracks in its wake. He stared at the papers with a mixture of defiance and dread, as though if he looked long enough the words might disappear. Seconds stretched into minutes. I did not move, did not speak, letting the weight of the silence do its work. They had come here demanding rescue. Now they faced the cost of it. Finally, Helen's voice broke through a whisper more fragile than I had ever heard from her. "Clara, you cannot ask us to write these words. You are our daughter. You know we love you, it's just—" Her plea trailed off, softening into the same kind of excuse I had lived under my entire life. I leaned forward slightly, my voice sharp, cutting through the trembling tone. Just that love always came with conditions. Just that every sacrifice, every praise, every ounce of pride belonged to Daniel. I grew up in that house as the forgotten one. Father, can you deny it? My father's face hardened, pride flashing like a blade, even as weariness etched deeper into his features. His voice burst out harsh and loud, reverberating against the walls. We did this for the future of the family. Daniel was our only hope. I rose from my chair, meeting him eye to eye, letting the words pour steady and unshaken. No, Daniel was the only hope you chose to see. And now that hope is gone. My mother buried her face in her hands, sobs breaking into jagged gasps. The tissue she clutched crumpled into nothing between her palms. My father stepped closer to the desk, his hand hovering over the pen as though it might sear him to touch it. His eyes locked on mine, burning with anger, but beneath the flame lay something rawer, fear, shame, and the gnawing weight of inevitability. "So this is what you want?" he asked hoarsely, his voice stripped of its thunder. "For us to admit we were wrong about you, wrong about everything?" "Yes," I answered quietly, yet with no hesitation. "Until you face the truth, nothing will change. And if nothing changes, I will not step in again." The room grew heavy again, but this time it was not the silence of avoidance. It was the silence of battle, the push and pull of pride against desperation. Helen lifted her head at last. Her tears streaked her face, her eyes swollen and raw, but her voice steadied in a way that surprised me. "Richard, if we don't sign, we lose everything." He turned to her, his jaw tight, his breath unsteady. His pride screamed to resist, but the truth pressed harder. His shoulders sagged under the weight of it. Slowly, with a stiffness that betrayed his reluctance, he lowered himself into the chair. His hand reached for the pen, his fingers trembling as he gripped it. The tip scratched across the page, his signature jagged, uneven, more defiance than surrender, but final nonetheless. My mother followed. Her hand shook so violently I thought she might drop the pen. Still she pressed it down, each stroke, heavy smudging where her tears fell onto the ink. I watched in silence as the papers filled with their names that once dismissed mine. When the last signature dried, I gathered the documents and folded them neatly. The sound of the crisp paper echoed in the room, small but sharp. The sound of something ending and something else beginning. When I looked up, I saw no superiority in their eyes, no blind certainty in Daniel's brilliance. What I saw instead was rawness, resentment tangled with regret, shame woven with reluctant recognition. For the first time in my life, I stood before them not as the overlooked daughter, but as their equal. My father leaned back heavily, his face pale, drained the lines of age more visible than ever. My mother clasped her hands together, her tears slowing her gaze lowered. Between them stretched a fragile silence no longer weighted with power, but with the slow crumble of pride. I let the quiet linger, feeling its shift. There was no triumph in me, not the kind Daniel would have chased. There was only clarity, sharp and cold. For years I had fought for a space in their world, begging for scraps of recognition. Tonight I had taken it without asking. Helen's voice broke the quiet, faint and almost childlike. "Clara, will this be enough? Will you help us keep the house?" I looked at her, then at him, and for once I did not rush to answer. I let the question settle, let them feel its weight. Finally I nodded once. "Yes, but this is the last time." Their eyes flickered not with relief exactly, but with a weary acceptance. They knew the terms. They knew the balance had shifted permanently. As they rose to leave, I noticed how different they looked from the parents who had walked in. No longer towering, no longer untouchable. Just two people who had gambled everything on the wrong son, now facing the bill. When the door closed behind them, I leaned back into my chair. The city lights flickered outside my window, a reminder that the world kept moving indifferent to our private wars. I rested my hand on the folder of signed documents. The ink was still drying, but its meaning was already permanent. For the first time I felt something stir inside me, something I had never felt in their presence before. Not affection, not forgiveness, not even relief. It was respect thin, fragile, hesitant, but real. And though it had come late, though it had come wrapped in sorrow, it was mine. That night, as I sat alone in the quiet, I knew one truth more clearly than ever. Families could wound, could betray, could blind themselves with pride. But accountability was not cruelty. It was the only way forward. And for the Mitchells, the reckoning had finally begun. The rain slid steadily down the tall windows of my office, streaks of gray weaving patterns across the glass. Chicago looked blurred from where I sat. The skyline softened under the curtain of a spring storm. I had just ended a video call with the board when my phone began to vibrate on the desk. The name on the screen made my stomach tighten. Daniel. For a moment I simply stared at it, the steady hum of rain filling the silence. A part of me wanted to let it ring until it stopped, to let him vanish into the mess he had created. But I pressed accept. His voice came through rough and uneven, tinged with slurred edges, as if alcohol had loosened his tongue but tightened something inside him. "Clara, you won, didn't you? You took it all. I have nothing left." The sound of his breathing rasped against the receiver, shallow and erratic, the kind of rhythm that belonged to someone who hadn't truly rested in weeks. My hand clenched on the edge of the desk. I had read the reports from Minneapolis sales, plummeting his team, unraveling his personal credit, sinking fast. I had even heard whispers about late nights gambling online, losing money he never had. Still hearing him like this, deflated hollow, was something I had not prepared for. I didn't speak right away. His words lingered in the air between us, heavy and raw. When he spoke again, the anger in him sounded like it had burned out, leaving only smoke. "It's all your fault," he said, but even the accusation came weakly, his tone frayed. "If you hadn't stepped in, I'd be sitting in that chair. I'd still have it all." I closed my eyes briefly and images rose on bidden dinners, where he smirked across the table while our parents beamed at him. My own silence pressed down by their pride in him, the sting of his endless jabs, the way he never missed an opportunity to remind me I was second best. And yet when I opened my eyes, my voice was calm, steadier than I felt. "Daniel, you are caught in the same cycle you've lived your whole life. I didn't steal anything from you. I only uncovered the truth." There was a pause long enough for the sound of rain to press itself into my ear. I thought he might hang up, Instead, I heard something I had never expected. A soft, broken sound. His voice cracked, a faint sob bleeding through. "I don't know what to do, Clara. I don't know how to get out of this. I need help." My breath caught. For years I had wanted him to feel the weight of consequence, to collapse under the burden of his arrogance. And now here it was. Yet it did not feel like triumph. It felt like standing at the edge of something darker, a place where punishment alone was no longer enough. "You say you need help," I said slowly. Each word deliberate. "Then you'll have to prove it." His silence was different this time, not defensive, not hostile. Just waiting. "You'll enter a treatment program for gambling addiction," I told him. "And you'll attend an ethics training course. Both. No arguments, no excuses. If you refuse, there won't be another chance." The line went quiet. Only the rain carried through, steady and relentless. I could almost picture him sitting in some dim apartment in Minneapolis, the curtains-drawn bottles stacked in the corner, staring at a life he no longer controlled. Finally, his voice came barely above a whisper. "Okay, I'll go." I exhaled tension I hadn't realized I was holding, easing slightly. My hand lingered on the phone before I ended the call. When the line went dead, I sat back in my chair. The city outside blurred and flickered under the storm lights, glowing faintly through the rain. Inside me, the emotions tangled. Not satisfaction, not vengeance, not even relief. Something more complicated. Something that felt closer to duty. I thought of the word that had echoed in my mind so often lately. Accountability. I had demanded it from my parents, forced it into their hands with signatures and confessions. And now, here was Daniel standing at the door of it too, whether he wanted to or not. Yet accountability was not the same as destruction. It was not only about tearing down. Sometimes it had to be the foundation for something new if the one standing on it could bear to rebuild. I remembered the look in my father's eyes when he signed his name, the defiance that cracked into weary surrender. I remembered my mother's tears dripping onto the paper, ink blurring under the weight of grief and acceptance. Tonight I heard the same fracture in Daniel's voice. For the first time, not pride, not anger, not entitlement. Just the hollow edge of recognition. I didn't know if redemption was possible for him. I didn't know if his promise would last beyond the next temptation, the next excuse. But I knew this: if there was even a sliver of chance, it would not come from shielding him as my parents always had. It would come from standing where he had fallen and facing the truth head on. I looked down at the stack of reports on my desk, the numbers chronicling his failures in precise columns. Losses, debts, wasted opportunities. They told one story. But the phone call had told another. A story not yet finished. I rose from my chair and moved to the window. The storm outside was relentless, the kind that scrubbed the air raw and left everything cleaner in its wake. I rested my palm against the cool glass, feeling the vibration of raindrops against it. Maybe I thought this was the beginning of Daniel's storm. And maybe, just maybe, there could be something after. That night I left the office later than usual. As I locked the door behind me, I carried not the satisfaction of victory, but the weight of choice. Justice had been served. But mercy was a different kind of power. And I had chosen for once to let it live beside justice. The Mitchell family had been torn apart by pride, favoritism, and lies. Now, in the quiet after the storm, there was a chance, however fragile, for something different. Not reconciliation, not yet. But perhaps the first steps toward redemption. And for the first time, I allowed myself to hope that karma did not only break, it could also rebuild. Morning sunlight stretched across the glass walls of my office, painting golden lines over the Chicago skyline. The city moved with its own rhythm horns, echoing faintly from below, ambition pulsing through every building in sight. On my desk lay the detailed plans for Sterling Corp's international expansion, each page a map pointing forward. In the corner, my gray blazer hung neatly, no longer a plain garment, but a witness to every storm I had walked through. The door opened, and Jennifer Torres stepped in her stride, confident, her laptop tucked under her arm. She connected it to the screen and numbers came alive. Bold graphs, steady growth, client satisfaction climbing. Her voice was calm, assured, every slide proof of nights spent rebuilding what others once dismissed. I watched her and pride filled me. Not the desperate pride I once longed for from my parents, but something cleaner built on fairness. She had been invisible, once her work stolen in Daniel's shadow. Now her name was attached to progress no one could deny. "You've done incredible work, Jennifer," I said quietly. She smiled, her eyes clear. "Thank you, Clara. For once, someone believed me enough to let me prove it." Her words settled inside me like sunlight breaking through clouds. This was the kind of legacy I wanted, not just profit, but a culture where truth and effort were seen. Outside my office, reports from Minneapolis confirmed Daniel had entered treatment. Whether he rebuilt or collapsed was no longer my burden to carry. His choices were his own now. I rose from my chair and walked to the glass wall. The city stretched vast and demanding, a reminder that my horizon was no longer bound by family expectations, but by the reach of my own choices. Sterling Corp was ready to cross oceans to step onto a global stage, and I was the one to guide it there. From the conference room next door came the sound of applause. The board was waiting. In minutes, I would step in and announce our expansion, a step that would carry us beyond anything the company had ever dared. I touched the door handle, pausing for a breath. Jennifer gathered her notes, her quiet determination steady living proof of what happens when truth is allowed to stand. I spoke softly, more to myself than to her. People once thought I didn't belong here. They thought I should stay behind, invisible. But today I stand as Clara Mitchell, leader of this company. The words steadied me. I opened the door and the applause swelled louder. This time I walked forward, not in anyone's shadow, but into my own light. And as I crossed the threshold, I carried one question meant not just for me, but for anyone who had ever been pushed aside. If the world tells you that you do not belong, will you accept it quietly? Or will you rise, stand, and claim